It's 1916. After 2 years of fighting, Serbia finally fallen under the pressure of the Central Powers, and by this the Austro-Hungarian Empire could shift resources from the southern front to other battlefields. On the eastern front, the Central Powers managed to stabilize the front, but they were not winning. On the Italian front, the Austro-Hungarian forces were in a defensive fight, just having enough resources to hold back the Italians in a meat-grinder style defense, but far from having enough resources or strength to strike back. Konrad von Hotzendorf, the ultimate commander of the Austro-Hungarian army, had to make a difficult decision: use the now available additional forces against the Russians or against the Italians. While the Italian front was somewhat stable, the eastern front was more under heat and relatively large territories were exchanging hands after each and every battle. The smart decision would be to use this force against Russia, but Hötzendorf had different plans. He wanted revenge on the Italians for their betrayal. For some time, General Conrad von Hötzendorf had been advocating for an offensive to cripple Italy, and he'd drawn up a plan for this. Now that additional units were at his disposal, he wanted to make this happen. The Austro-Hungarian army had two options: attack on the Isonzo front, and once breaking through the Italian lines, the Monarchy's army would access the Italian plains. However, this was the strongest part of the Italian front line, and this was where they concentrated their strongest and best armies. The other option was to surprise the Italians and attack them from where they didn't expect it, from the north via the Alps mountains. This was a risky plan, as moving a large army, artillery, supplies to the north is a challenging task. Hötzendorf studied both options and decided to attack from the north. His ultimate goal, or hope, was that if he can surprise the Italians and they can break through to Venice, the Austro-Hungarian army can isolate the 4th, 2nd and 3rd army, and by this they would be surrounded. He reached out to Germany to request support. However, at this time Germany was not at war with Italy just yet. Also, they focus was on fighting the Russians and on the French at Verdun. The German commander, General Erich von Falkenhayn, refused to help and advised against this plan. However, Hötzendorf was confident in his plan and decided to go ahead even without German help. This was a risky plan. Moving this huge and large army, artillery and supplies to the north was very challenging, especially at the time without proper roads to supply them. The Austro-Hungarian army carefully and under the utmost secrecy shuffled around the battalions to concentrate them on the Italian front. They pulled together around 2000 artillery units. This plan was under such a secrecy that even the battalion and regiment commanders left out, and the only thing they knew that they are being moved to prepare for some kind of offensive against Russia. For this attack, the High Command organized around 300 battalions, which was around 300,000 soldiers. They were facing the Italian 1st and 4th Army with around 172 battalions, which was around 250,000 soldiers. They were also supported by around 850 artillery pieces. Regardless of all this secret preparation, the Italians noticed the concentration of the troops. The two leaders of the Italian armies on the South Tyrolean front repeatedly requested reinforcement from their chief of staff. However, Cadorna rejected any troop transfers, viewing the Austro-Hungarian army's action as nothing else but deceptive maneuver to take away pressure from the Isonzo front. Nevertheless, he ordered the expansion of the defensive lines and allowed the front to be straightened. Highly exposed positions were abandoned and pulled back. The Italians considered this sector almost impenetrable. The front line's flanks were protected by fortifications such as Forte Monteverena, Forte Campologno, and this defense system was 3 lines deep. Meanwhile, the German general, August von Kramon, representing the Supreme German Army Command, voiced serious concerns about the planned offensive to the Austro-Hungarian command. Falkenhayn preferred deploying Austro-Hungarian units in France, believing that this planned offensive had little chance to succeed. As expected, Konrad von Hötzendorf rejected this request as preparations were too advanced to stop. The Austro-Hungarians' plan was that the main thrust will be carried out by the 11th Army led by Colonel General Dang, supported by the artillery of the 3rd Army, and once the 11th Army broke through the Italian lines, the 3rd Army pushed into the wedge, expand and secure it while acting as strategic reserve for the spearhead units. Once they secured the area, the 11th Army was to move south to the direction of Venice, and by reaching the sea, surrounding the Italian armies in the east, and by that crush them or starve them out. The offensive was planned to start on the 15th of May 1916, however, due to bad weather for days, the assault troops were unable to conduct a large-scale offensive. General Dang set the start of the general attack on the 17th of May 1916, However, the High Command in Teschen informed him that the attack must begin immediately. At this point, the barrage of 369 guns began. The Italian fortifications, Forte Monteverena, the neighboring Forte Campo Lugno, and the still unfinished Forte Campo Molon had already been bombed by artillery in June 1915, and due to the damages, they were only capable of infantry defense and were unable to return any artillery fire. Nevertheless, they were again under heavy fire and this time completely destroyed. As per the plan, the artillery of the Third Army did not fire into its own offensive sector, but turned their guns to support the attacking forces. The approximately 6-kilometer wide front of the Italian 35th Infantry Division was under fire, particularly the area of the Ancona Brigade. At 9 am, the so-called annihilation shooting was executed, and at 10 am, the order for the infantry to attack was ordered. Shortly afterwards, the Kaiserjäger of the 1/3rd under Captain Oreste Caldini were the first Austro-Hungarian units to penetrate the Italian trenches at Malga Pioverna. Even though the element of surprise was lost, the trenches were overrun almost everywhere in the first attack. The situation was looking good for Austro-Hungarian forces, and this gave them false confidence. At this point, a risky move was ordered. The 3rd Army Group, which was supposed to follow the 11th Army, was told to abandon their original orders, and they were deployed alongside, widening the attacking sector. Due to this, the offensive force was left without reserve. After some initial gains, resistance grew stronger, and quickly gathered Italian reserves made it harder to advance further. On 20 May 1916, the Austro-Hungarian troops advanced into the Asiago Plateau. In view of the initial Austro-Hungarian successes and the increasing danger of breakthrough, Cadorna had the 5th Army under General Pietro Frugoni formed. These troops, assembled from reserve units and units transferred from the Isonzo front and even from Albania, were positioned in the lowlands between Vicenza and Treviso. This gave the Italians about 180,000 men as reserves. This shouldn't be a major issue, however, by ordering the 3rd Army to abandon the original plan and engage in an offensive meant that the 11th Army left without enough manpower to fight this additional Italian army. On 28 May 1916, after a long and exhausting fight, Asiago eventually had fallen. The Austro-Hungarian forces were exhausted, low on munition, and had weak supply lines. After many attempts, the offensive forces failed to break out into lowlands by end of May, slowly grinding up their resources and manpower. In the meantime, something important happened far away from the Alps. On 4th of June 1916, the Brusilov offensive was launched by Russia. On 8th of June 1916, the German Chief of General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, urged Konrad von Hötzendorf to transfer troops to the Russian front to support the retreating Austro-Hungarian 4th and 7th armies. Initially, Hötzendorf was reluctant, still hopeful for success in the South Tyrol offensive with the limited resources they still had. However, continuous catastrophic news from the Eastern Front eventually compelled him to halt his offensive efforts. On 12th of June 1916, a desperate attempt to breach the Italian lines, Austro-Hungarian army tried to break through just southwest of Arciero without any success. Only a few days later, on 15th of June 1916, the last attack attempt by the exhausted entire 11th army was carried out on Monte Giove, but this failed. In the meantime, renewed limited attack attempt by the 3rd Army launched on 15th of June between Monte Le Merle and Monte Zovetto, which was just south of Asiago, but this also failed. There was not much left to do. The 3rd and 11th Army was exhausted, their lines were stretched thin and running low on ammunition. On the evening of June 1916, the Austro-Hungarian Army High Command transmitted the order to transition to defense, and with this, the Strafexpedition came to an end. Like many other actions of the Austro-Hungarian armed forces, this one was also characterized by 3 factors: zu wenig, zu unentschlossen, zu kraftlos, too little, too indecisive, too powerless. As usual, there were tactical and strategic mistakes on the part of the High Command and the Army Group. Some of the mistakes were the 5-day delay of the 3rd Corps in order to use its artillery support to the 20th Corps. Then the 2 armies, the 11th and the 3rd, did not advance one after the other, as was operationally planned, but the 3rd Army was suddenly launched to attack alongside with the 11th Army, leaving them without any reserves. Making matters worse, the artillery units did not receive enough ammunition, and advancing across the mountainous front made the resupply even more difficult for ammunition and for food for the soldiers. The offensive was doomed from the start, and is seen as a major mistake by the High Command for attempting it without German support. They acted here not for the first time, according to the proverbial motto: somehow, it will be fine. The Monarchy's army, weakened by the withdrawal of troops to repel the Brusilov offensive and facing adverse circumstances, any further advance into the Venetian plain seems unrealistic, especially without any German support. Although the Strafexpedition failed to reach its goal, it had political consequences in Italy. The Salandra cabinet fell, and Paolo Boselli became the new prime minister.